Good evening. Welcome to PoliticIt podcast. We've got Mike McKell with us today, and Senate District 25.
Yeah.
Right. And so Mike's my seatmate in the Senate. So I thought
It's a difficult job, John.
Yeah, I bet. So Mike, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about you, your background? I mean, you got to tell us something about Farron too.
Yeah, I will. And thank you for having me on. And you have been a great seatmate. It's fun sitting next to Senator Johnson, and I do my best to try to corrupt you a little bit. And you've held firm. You've held the line for a long time. But my background is a lot, similar to a lot of folks. I grew up in rural Utah. Grew up in the big city of Farron. When I tell people about Farron, most people don't know where that is. So it's south of Price, about 40 or 50 miles. And I went to Emory High School, and it was a great community to grow up in. I had really fond memories. We had a family farm and did a lot of farm work. We always had horses. We always had cattle. Today, because of that, obviously I've got horses, and that's a fun thing to do. But great way to grow up. I went to SUU, then went off to law school. I live in Spanish Fork. I've got 2 boys, 2 girls. My oldest son's up at the U. It's been a pretty brutal football season this year, but that's a little bit about me. Practicing attorney.
That's hard being a U fan where you live, right?
No, there's a lot of Utah fans in Spanish Fork. It's just been a difficult season. I mean, to be honest with you, I'm hoping the game against BYU is a little bit better. I always cheer for BYU, except when they play Utah, and I'm hoping that we get our season back on track at Rice-Eccles Stadium here in a couple weeks.
Oh wow! You ruined that perfect record. Is that what?
If that's what it takes to get a win for the Utes, it's not looking good. It's been a pretty rough season for the Utes.
Yeah, it has been. So you're a lawyer?
Yeah.
Law school at BYU? Is that right?
I actually went to law school in Idaho.
Oh, in Idaho.
It was a good fit for me. I came out of SUU, and I looked at several law schools. University of Idaho waived my out-of-state tuition. I had a young family. By the time within the first 3 weeks of law school, we had my second child. We had 3 kids by the time I finished, and affordability really did matter. And I had a wonderful experience.
So which school in Idaho?
University of Idaho.
Okay.
Clear up in Moscow.
Oh.
And Representative Peterson, Val Peterson, the House,
yeah?
the executive approach chair. His dad Chuck was actually my bishop in Idaho, and I got to work with him and the young men in the ward, and it was a good fit for me.
That's cool. And so after law school?
After law school, just a shameless, boring attorney. I still practice law.
But you're an attorney that actually makes money doing it.
I sure try to. We work hard for our clients. I am in the law office every day. The session's always tough. That's the one thing about serving the legislature. And you know this, it's hard for a lot of our colleagues because we do have jobs in the real world. But I've got great partners that I work with. I've got great staff that I work with. But law office, it stays open when we're in session, certainly.
Yeah, so that actually takes a lot of your time.
It does, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and so I guess I know one of your hobbies is horses. So
I really have a couple hobbies. So I like to run marathons, and I do race horses. So today, for you, John, I thought you would ask. So you see the inside liner of the suit. I brought the horses today. Growing up, my dad raced horses, and when his health started to fade, I always promised myself I'd never race horses, but his health started to fade, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to do something cool for my dad, and I bought a couple race horses, and I thought I'm going to take him to the track, and I'm going to manage this so he has an opportunity to do it, and a lot of really good memories before he passed at the track, but the truth is I got hooked, and we
have another colleague in the Senate that does the same thing, huh? David Hinkins.
He does, and I'll tell you, Dave's got some great horses. I was out in L.A. A few weeks ago with Dave, and his horse ran a great race, and it was fun being there with him. But Dave's a guy that I grew up with. Out in Emory County, he and my dad were always close. They were always good friends. They raced horses together. But it's a great way to lose money. It's a lot of fun. But one of the things I like about it, it involves my whole family. My wife Brandy loves to go to the track with me. The kids get to work on the farm. They get to muck stalls. And for me, first and foremost, I love the animal. I think a horse is an incredible animal to be around, and it makes a hobby a lot easier when you love to do it.
Yeah. It sounds like too much work for me.
It's a lot of work. It's fun work.
Yeah. So Mike, one of the things I was kind of curious about your opinion on was, Amendment D.
Yeah.
We've been hit pretty hard in the press, saying that, this is just a legislative grab. And I kind of wonder what your perspective of the whole thing is.
I think Amendment D is really troubling. So I've served in the legislature now. This was my 12th session. And Amendment D to me, and what we're talking about is this initiative process, and we were trying to wrestle with the ruling from the Supreme Court. In my 12 years of serving the legislature, I think this is one of the most frightening things that I've seen in a long time. And it's not because we don't want the public involved. We absolutely do want the public involved. But we are a republic, and we're a republic for a reason. And I think there's just a host of concerns with the initiative process. And I'm not here to scare people and say, we don't want Utah to become California. We don't want Utah to have the same problems we see in Arizona. But it is a real threat, and we need to embrace that, and we need to acknowledge the fact that the initiative process that we passed is incredibly problematic. And there's a lot of reasons why, and I'm happy to go. My analysis of why it's problematic. I'm happy to talk about that.
Well, I think that's the important thing. I mean, this is, of course, is tied to the Better Boundaries initiative, right? This idea that, and I think it's important that we talk about that, because it's pretty clear in the Constitution that the legislature has the power to apportion the districts. After a census, right? Sure. I mean, I think that's a very clear part of the Constitution.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden we have this initiative, Better Boundaries, that was supposed to create an independent redistricting commission. And I mean, that sounds good, right? Independent. We should be independent.
Yeah.
But I think it's somewhat problematic. And what's happened with this is that now there was it's kind of surprising that what was clear in the Constitution with respect to redistricting now is not quite so clear.
Well,
and why don't you talk a little bit about what this decision did, right? And why it's not clear.
And to be clear, for me, I worry about what's going to happen going forward. We lost the lawsuit on redistricting, but that's not what frightens me. It's what happens next. The ruling of the court empowered initiatives in a way that it's not helpful, and it's not good for the state of Utah. And let me give you some examples. Only about less than half of the states in the nation allow for this type of initiative. But the difficulty for me as a lawmaker, and I think for the state, is we have now elevated initiatives in a way that they're not subject to amendment the same way that a law. You and I have worked together for 4 years. I've passed legislation. You've passed legislation. You've seen me come back and work on legislation that I've passed years before.
Because you might find there's an unintended consequence. You might find there's something that should have been done better.
Yeah, so for example, I worked on congregate care, the troubled teen industry. I passed Senate Bill 127. The next session I came back with Senate Bill 139 because I had to make some substantive changes. The difficulty that we have with this new initiative process is we have taken a public initiative and we have elevated it in a way that it almost can't be amended. And the standard is called strict scrutiny. And strict scrutiny is a standard that is just really difficult. As an attorney, it's just really difficult to meet. And I'll give you an example. I work as a civil attorney, and when I go before a judge or a jury, I need to prove my case by a preponderance of the evidence, so more likely than not. And that's the standard. If there's a criminal case and somebody is being charged with a crime, that standard, you've got to meet that beyond a reasonable doubt. And that standard is extremely difficult to meet. And when we're dealing with an initiative, if we want to change that initiative, if we want to make any form of substantive change, that has to be done with strict scrutiny. And I compare it kind of to that beyond a reasonable doubt, that criminal standard, and it just makes it very, very difficult. So the initiative process, it's going to be started by citizens. There's not an amendment process in the legislature. Senator Johnson, you serve on you serve as the chair of the Education Committee, and we do the work of the committee. We amend bills, we take public feedback, we amend bills. Oftentimes that bill is going to pass as the third, fourth, fifth substitute because we get to take feedback and modify it. And if a year later that bill has a problem, we get to come back. But with this initiative process, there's not a committee process, there's not an amendment process, and we've taken
not public comment.
And we've taken it to a whole different level, and we've said there's strict scrutiny, and the problem is it becomes almost like a constitutional amendment, and it's almost impossible to change, and that's what concerns me. That is a terrible, terrible way to legislate.
So there is this idea, though, that we can modify it if there's a compelling state interest, right? And you go back to that strict scrutiny thing that you said, but what amazes me with that is, okay, so if there's a compelling state interest, who gets to decide whether there's a compelling state interest?
Well, and that's the problem. It goes back to the courts, and at that point, we're allowing the courts to do our job. We were elected to set policy and to do lawmaking and do the amendment process, take public input, but at that point, it becomes the court's role, and I think that encroaches into the legislative process. There are, of the states that have initiatives, there's only 2 states that don't have a really good amendment process, and California is one of them. And it is a difficult issue, and we've got colleagues that we meet at conferences that are in California, and our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, the Democrats on the other side of the aisle, they struggle with initiatives in California as well, and it's difficult. Let me talk about another issue that really scares me with the initiatives. There was a Supreme Court decision years ago called Citizens United, and the holding in Citizens United, to me, is frightening because I think there must be transparency. But the holding says that if you're a 501c4, you're not required to disclose your donors. And you're not required to disclose who's funding this 501c4 or this PAC, and what's going to happen. And this is what happens in other states. You're going to have you potentially have foreign money, and that's not the legislature trying to scare the public. There are a number of examples where Canadian companies engaged in the initiative process in the United States. So you potentially have foreign money, and you can potentially have money from the right and the left, and it's going to be tens of millions of dollars. And because of Citizens United, it's not something that you can track, and it's not something that there's transparency. So you have an ability to fund an initiative with money. I'd call it dark money, and there's several interesting books. There's a book called The Blueprint: How Colorado Went from Red to Blue, and there's a book called Dark Money that talks about money coming from the right, and money flows from the right and the left into these PACs, but you can't see it, and if you can't see it, my concern is, how does the public vet information that's being given to them if they don't know where the money's coming from? And it's a serious transparency.
They don't know what the objectives are of the people with the money.
And we've invited that. That Supreme Court decision is absolutely invited dark money to flow into the state of Utah. That's exactly what's going to happen. That's not, I'm trying to scare the public. That's what happens in California. That's what happens in Arizona. And it's certainly what is going to happen in Utah. You will see tens of millions of dollars over the next decade that'll flow to Utah, pushing initiatives, and it'll be funded by people that we may agree with, we may not agree with, but we just won't know. And that's not a good way to make a decision.
Yeah. We're going to take a break. Okay, and we'll be right back.
This is Jim Moss, Chairman of the Utah State Board of Education. Senator John Johnson is a true champion for Utah's students and families. He's worked tirelessly to eliminate divisive politics from our classrooms and focus on what actually brings success for all students, engaging with a broad array of stakeholders. People may not know that John is a former college professor and that he serves on the board of the School of the Future at Utah State University, which has helped the board and local schools around the state to improve early literacy by understanding the science of reading and reading instruction. He has helped to make historic investments to improve our education system and increase teacher pay, and Utah is now in the top 10 in the nation for starting teacher salary. In 2024, U.S. News ranked Utah second in the nation in education. John's dedicated to ensuring that every student, regardless of their background, can learn, succeed, and achieve their American dream. and he's worked with me to ensure that the elected State Board of Education is respected as a partner with the legislature in formulating education policy. That's why John has my full support and endorsement.
Welcome back to PoliticIt. We've got Mike McKell here. So, Mike, we've been talking about this initiative process. And offline, we were discussing different aspects of it. But why don't you comment just a little bit on this court decision and what your major problem is with the decision itself?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. And my overriding concern with the court is the court's put itself into a policy-making position at this point. With a standard like strict scrutiny, that's going to go back before the court, and really what's going to happen is the court, we're lawmakers, we set policy. That's what we do. That's why there's separation of powers. There's so many unknowns right now.
They've kind of jumped into our lane in a way, haven't they?
They jumped in our lane. Certainly they jumped into our lane, and these decisions will go back to the court. And let me just address one issue, and this is probably more technical, but the courts, the initiative that they looked at, in a way, they tied it to government reform initiatives. And a government reform initiative, you could see redistricting as government reform. If there was a group that wanted to do a term limits initiative, I think that would be government reform. If there was an attempt to do a jungle primary or a direct primary or something tied to election, that would be government reform. And some people think that because the court, this decision talked about government reform initiatives, some people think that the analysis would be different for other initiatives. So an initiative on abortion or medical marijuana. And one of my concerns when I read the decision, I just don't think you can distinguish it that way. And one of my concerns is that the analysis used by the Supreme Court to deal with a government reform initiative, I think they were silent on other initiatives, but I don't think they distinguished it in a way that same standard could apply. And I think that's frightening, that you could have that amount of money flowing to Utah without transparency on issues like marijuana, issues like abortion, at the same time not having transparency that the public gets to see that.
So what kind of thing with abortion could happen?
I think you could see initiatives like you've seen in other states, and you'd have tens of millions of dollars flowing into the state from groups outside the state of Utah, money that's not disclosed, and you've seen initiatives across the country, right? And that could happen in Utah. And for me, the question is, well, what standard would be applied if that initiative didn't go through an amendment process, if it didn't conform with our code, if we needed to make changes? Arguably, that same standard of strict scrutiny, which is compelling state interest. You brought up the word compelling state interest and strict scrutiny are the same thing, and that standard is really, really difficult to meet. And if that was an initiative that was problematic, it didn't fit in our code, it cost the taxpayers tens of millions of dollars, it would be very difficult for the legislature to make amendments or changes. And that's what concerns me with Amendment D.
And we have like on medical marijuana.
Yeah.
We tightened the standard to make sure that it actually was medical marijuana.
We did, and I think most of your viewers know this, but if the legislature hadn't come back and tightened that medical marijuana, it was recreational marijuana. That's the way it was written. It was written in a way that would have opened it up to recreational marijuana. And I understand there are some folks that want recreational marijuana in the state, but the legislature had an ability to say, you know what, let's pull back the reins. We'll work with you, and we'll implement medical marijuana with a process that conforms with our state. These different departments in the state will regulate it in a way that's appropriate and necessary. But without that ability, we would have recreational marijuana today. And an initiative like that, for us to change it, we would have to meet that strict scrutiny standard, and I don't think we could.
Yeah, and you think about the Medicaid reform, right?
Yeah. So it concerns me. The question now is, what do we do about it? Obviously, people that are paying attention, we had a bad ruling from the court. We had some process issues. So voters, whether you vote for or against Amendment D, obviously Amendment D is not going to be counted. And I don't know when this podcast will drop. So if it's past the election, it wasn't counted. So the question is, what does the legislature do now? And what I think we need to look. I think we need to look at this issue long and hard. I think we need to spend time with the public. I think we need to educate the public of the problems with the initiative process. Number one, first and foremost, the legislature needs an ability to amend initiative. And we can't have an initiative elevated above the code itself. An initiative,
unless it's a constitutional amendment.
Unless it's a constitutional amendment. And the problem is these initiatives, they're afforded constitutional amendment status, and they're not constitutional amendments. And that's the difficulty. The laws that you pass, there's a new order. There's a statute that a lawmaker passes.
Which can be modified.
Which can be modified without strict scrutiny.
In fact, you just gave examples of your own bills that you modified.
So we have this new tier. We have a legislative statute. Now we have a public initiative statute. And at that same level is a constitutional amendment, because they're almost on par with each other. So we've got to find a way to have an ability to amend initiatives when they move forward in a way that makes sense, a way that's responsible in the state of Utah. There are certain states where there is almost a cooling off period, where there's a look back period. You can amend an initiative, but you have to wait a year. You have to wait 2 years. I think that's something that we should consider. But more than anything, I think we need to have a really frank and honest discussion with the public. I think the public needs to understand what our concerns are. And I think it's okay to go in front of a large group of people, go to a town hall meeting, and stand up and say, here are the problems with initiatives. We respect the people, we respect the public, but having a initiative process without transparency that can't be amended, it's just not logistically sound for our state. It's not what our founders envisioned. We are a republic for a reason. We are elected to be policymakers, and if there's a problem with the policy we make, we remove the policymakers. But not having an ability to amend, it's really going to tie our hands in a way that's really harmful. And I've heard some of my colleagues that were supportive of these decisions of the court say, well, the legislature's not being truthful. This strict scrutiny is not like a constitutional amendment. And I'll tell you, my legal analysis is totally different than that. I think it is. I think they're going to be difficult to amend. And more frightening than that, we're going to put that issue back into the courts to set the policy instead of the legislature. And we are inviting the courts into our legislative policymaking lane. And I guess we're not inviting; they've invited themselves.
So
right?
do you think we messed up in some ways, though? Because when I see this talk on one side of the issue, it appears as if this was an attempt by the legislature to pull power away from the people, which is and the reality of it is this is really a shift of power between the people and the legislature and the courts, right? And so I don't think we communicated that message very hard. It's a message that's hard to communicate. Mm-hmm. And I think instructions too. I mean, there were some problems with the way that was written.
And I'll be really frank on this. I think it's okay to say that we didn't do a good job with it. And I think we've learned. The Constitution does say all political power is inherent in the people. And you and I are in the legislature. We sit next to each other because the people put us there. And that power to put us in the legislature is inherent in the people. And that is the principle of a republic. But I think we need to spend more time with the public, making sure the public understands what we're dealing with and the difficulties of that initiative process. We've got to fix this together. I think it's a problem, and it's going to take the public understanding why we're moving forward with changes and what problems that we've created.
Yeah, I think you're right. So we're out of time.
Okay.
Any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, you know what? Just thank you for having me on. It's been fun having. I'm going to look at the camera right now. It's been fun having Senator Johnson as my seatmate for the last 4 years. We've had a lot of fun, and we've done a lot of work. Senator Johnson in the Senate works hard and is very passionate about issues he cares about, and I appreciate that. The Senate's a cool body. We kind of look after each other. We work hard we work hard on issues that we care about. But no, thank you for having me on, and thank you for your friendship.
Yeah, thank you. Nice having you. We'll see you guys next week.